Good morning, brethren, and welcome to our bi-weekly program entitled A Glance at the Word, which is broadcast live on Facebook every Monday and every Wednesday at 8 a.m. West Africa time, which is 7 a.m. GMT. Today is Wednesday, the 13th of July, 2022, and we're going to continue with the same topic that we started on Monday, the 4th of July, and which is entitled Self-Sentence Death Penalty. Self-Sentence Death Penalty. Today is part 4 of this teaching, and the title this morning is Eli's Children's Death. Eli's Children's Death. Let's first read in the book of God. We're going to read in the Word of God. Let's read 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 12 to 17. I'm going to give you all the verses before we read them. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 12 to 17, verse 22, verse 34. Then we'll read again 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. I repeat it all over. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 12 to 17, verse 22, verse 34. 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. Let's read. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 12 to 17. Now, the children of Eli were corrupt. They didn't know the Lord. And the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servants would come with a three-pronged flesh hook, a three-pronged flesh hook in his hand while the meat was boiling. Then he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest will take for himself all that the flesh hook brought up. So they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Also, before they burned the fat, the priest's servants would come and say to the man who sacrificed, "Give meat for roasting to the priest, for he will not take boiled meat from you, but raw." And if the man said to him, "They should really burn the fat first, then you may take as much as your heart desires," he would then answer him, "No, but you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force." Therefore, the sin of the young man was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. Verse 22. Now Eli was very old, and he heard everything his sons did to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Verse 34. Verse 34. Now this shall be a sign to you that will come upon your two sons, on Hophni and Phinehas. In one day they shall die, both of them. Now let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. There was a very great slaughter, and there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. Also the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Okay, you see, in the times of the judges in Israel, Eli was both the high priest and the judge in Israel. Eli had two sons whose names were Hophni and Phinehas. These two sons of his were also priests according to the Levitic law and the law of Moses. So Eli was already old, not too far to his death. And according to the Levitic law, he was to be replaced by one of his sons as high priest, either Hophni or Phinehas, whoever was the elder. But the word of God that we read clearly tells us that Hophni and Phinehas were corrupt. And they didn't actually know the Lord whom they were serving or whom they were supposed to be serving. So their behavior was a great shame for the service of the Lord, for the ministry, and for the whole Israel. They were despising and reviling the sacrifices that were being offered to God. They were despising and reviling the tabernacle of the covenant of God. Thus, they were despising and reviling God himself. Hophni and Phinehas were spending all their time desecrating God's house, desecrating sacred things and objects, and desecrating divine service. They were profanating the ministry. They were profanating the house of God. So they were led by a spirit of profanation, but they were led by the spirit of desecration. Hophni and Phinehas didn't keep any rules regarding the sacrifices offered to God. And they defiled the tabernacle of God by shamefully committing adultery with women who were coming to pray and to worship God. Their father Eli warned them, but they didn't heed the voice of their father. Their behaviors and actions were a self-sentence to death. They were pronouncing, in behaving that way, in acting that way, they were pronouncing a self-sentence death penalty. They were sentencing themselves to death. You know, the spirit of desecration is a direct self-sentence death penalty. And remember what God said in Matthew chapter 18, verse 18. It's a verse that everybody knows very well. God said, "Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. This also means that a self-sentenced death penalty pronounced on earth is acknowledged in heaven as actually being a self-sentenced death penalty. And that sentence is meant to be executed. It is meant to be carried out because heaven would put the seal on that self-sentenced death penalty. Now let's read Ezekiel chapter 22. Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 26. Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 26. We read, "Her priests have violated my law and profaned my holy things. They have not distinguished between the holy and unholy, nor have they made known the difference between the unclean and the clean. And they have hidden their eyes from my Sabbaths, so that I am profaned among them." This saying is exactly the image of what Hophni and Phinehas were doing. Hophni and Phinehas were priests, and they were violating God's law regarding priesthood. They were violating God's law regarding sacred things. They were violating God's law regarding holiness. And they were violating God's law regarding cleanliness and uncleanliness. So Hophni and Phinehas were violating the law of the tabernacle of God. In behaving this way, they have profaned God and all that was related to God. They have desecrated all that was meant to be sacred. And according to the law of Moses, these actions, these behaviors, this profanation deserved death. Thus, in profaning God and the tabernacle, Hophni and Phinehas were sentencing themselves to death. They were pronouncing a self-sentenced death penalty. My brethren, beware of profanation or desecration. The spirit of profanation or desecration is a spirit of death. He who practices profanation is attracting death unto himself. In other words, if you are practicing profanation, if you are desecrating sacred things, if you are desecrating what is meant to be sacred, know that you are pronouncing a self-sentenced death penalty. When we read Exodus chapter 31, verse 14, we clearly understand that every profanation leads to the death of its author. Every profanator deserves death. And elsewhere in Leviticus, such as Leviticus 19, verse 8, we see that profaning sacred things is punished with a death penalty. So, Besides the fact that Hophni and Phinehas deserved death because of the different sins that they have been committing, knowing that the wages of sin is death. Besides that, Hophni and Phinehas also deserved death because of profanation, because they were profanators. Many so-called sons of God also behave like Hophni and Phinehas. They despise the godly sonship and they revile God. You know, there are many ways that you can revile God. For example, not respecting sons of God is profanation. If you don't respect the envoy, this means that you don't respect the sender either. And God's servants are God's envoys. It's God who sent them. If you don't respect them, you don't respect God who sent them. Refusing to obey the instructions of servants of God in the exercise of their divine duties is profanation. Having no consideration or little consideration for the house of God is profanation. Putting the house of God at the same level as any other house is profanation, because the house of God is sacred. Despising or desecrating things that must be considered as sacred things is profanation. For example, offerings are sacred things. Tithes are sacred things. Making fun of God or making fun of the word of God is profanation. Having little esteem or no esteem for what is given or what is to be given to the church or to the servants of God is profanation. Skipping or avoiding church services without any legitimate reason, or choosing willingly to always be arriving late at church services and church activities, those also are signs of profanation. There are many ways that one can profane God. But the most important thing to know is that every profanation is a self-sentenced death penalty. Thus, to avoid pronouncing a self-sentenced death penalty, to avoid being a victim of a self-sentenced death penalty, you must avoid being involved in any kind of profanation. You must avoid being involved in profanation of any kind. Hophni and Phinehas died because they were reviling God, because they were despising God, because they were profaning God. Profaning anything that is related to God is equivalent to profaning God himself. And this deserves death. Don't be involved in profanation of any kind at all. Dear brethren, God bless you abundantly beyond all your expectations. We're going to continue with the same topic, self-sentenced death penalty, on Monday, the 18th of July, 2022. Meanwhile, dearest brethren, keep in mind that you must avoid at all cost to profane God and all that is related to God and all that is sacred. Once more, God bless you.